Welcome to another edition of Beyond the Headlines. I'm Ryan Gilchrist, Managing Editor of Post and Courier Greenville. Thank you so much for being with us today. We're going to be discussing a story we published this last weekend entitled Innocence Lost. It tells the story of Charles Wakefield, who spent 34 years in a South Carolina prison for an infamous Greenville double murder, about which I think it's fair to say many questions remain. That brings me to my fellow panelists today, Connor Hughes, who's a reporter in our Greenville newsroom, typically covers the Golden Strip cities of Malden, Simpsonville, and Fountain Inn. Connor, thanks for being here.
Sure, happy to be here.
We also have Glenn Smith, the public service editor for Post and Courier. He also leads the investigative team and recently has been spending a lot of time on our Uncovered project, which may go on forever. Glenn, thanks for being with us.
Sure thing, thanks.
So we're going to take a dive into this, and for the purposes of this, we're going to assume most of you watching this have read the story. If you haven't, by all means, please do so after this. But seeing as how this is beyond the headlines, we're going to try and get to maybe some of the things that either weren't in the story or that give you a deeper look at what's going on. So Connor, let's start with you. You've been tracking this story for a long time. I know you and I had our first conversation about it almost a year ago now. Can you tell us a little more about two people at the core of this story, namely Charles Wakefield and Brad Willis?
Sure, absolutely. So as you mentioned, yeah, I've been aware of this story since the podcast first aired in 2019 and knew there was a lot to it. I mean, Brad Willis is the person behind the podcast, Murder, Etc., which I think a lot of people here listening are familiar with, where he's just unpacking this incredibly complicated, long story about this double homicide that happened in 1975, where Frank Looper, Greenville County narcotics investigator, and his father Rufus were essentially executed in the garage next to their West Greenville home. And so that's how I was introduced to the story, was just when this podcast first aired and I heard about Brad and started listening to it and just hearing about this story, and knew that it was something that I wanted to cover. I wasn't covering news in Greenville at the time, but when I came here, it was something I wanted to prioritize. And as you had asked, the two central characters. So obviously the person really at the center of this story is Charles Wakefield, who's now 67 years old. He was convicted when he was about, in his early 20s, for these two murders that he has since day one said that he did not commit. There's always been questions about the evidence against him. It was fairly sparse. It's basically two eyewitnesses who have a long and complicated history. And then there's so he's really at the center. And then there's Brad Willis, who's dedicated so much time to reporting this. And Brad's connection to it is, as I say in the story, in 2001, he was a 27-year-old reporter with WIFF. He wasn't aware of all of the background and all the questions around the story, and finds out that Charles Wakefield was being paroled after, about a quarter century in prison, and ran a story on it. And that story ultimately led to that parole for Charles Wakefield being rescinded. And shortly thereafter, an attorney who was representing Charles Wakefield came to him and brought him this voluminous case file and said, there's so much more to this case than you realized, and dropped it on his desk. And as Brad learned more and more, this kind of huge amount of doubt started to grow, and he started to feel a tremendous amount of guilt, really, for his role in this and keeping Charles Wakefield behind bars. And so eventually he really said, he's no longer a local journalist here, but he's really dedicated just a lot of his own personal time to working on this story and developing this just huge, sprawling, in-depth podcast, looking at the case around this, just kind of in a way. Part of it, I think, is just because it's a really complicated, strange story that I think piqued his curiosity. But I think, in talking to him, a lot of it is him kind of searching for redemption for for what happened in 2001, where he on a certain level led to Charles Wakefield spending about another 9 or 10 years in prison.
You actually sat down with Wakefield in his home. What sort of details can you give us there? What was that conversation like?
Sure. I mean, we talked in our first conversation. We've talked quite a few times since then, but we sat down for about 2.5 hours in his living room and just talked for a long time. And he's tired at this point. I mean, he's spent 34 years in prison. As I say in the story, he was paroled in 2010, but he really hasn't been free since 1975, since he was first arrested. He's trying to put his life back together after spending most of it in prison, living with this conviction that still, hangs over his head. It's affected relationships. It's affected his ability to get gainful employment. Part of something that didn't make it in the story is that, he doesn't know when he's ever going to be able to stop working because he has not been able to work to save for retirement, this whole time. So he's financially kind of on thin ice. It's affected his relationship with all his family. He's just kind of this lonely guy who's frustrated about what's happened, and he's still fighting to clear his name. He recently has sent the story, and as Brad has reported, he's requested a new trial based on some new evidence that's come forward since the podcast, Murder Center podcast, started. And so he's never given up actively trying to clear his name, and he's tired. I mean, talking to him, it was very clear that he's frustrated, he's tired, but he's still hopeful. So that's really where he is now. He kind of remains in this strange kind of limbo, kind of this purgatory, where he's still dealing with this, as he insists consistently that he had absolutely nothing to do with it.
Right. Glenn, the story's a little bit newer to you, or certainly at least not in the same depth that Connor's known about it in the past. What attracted you to this, and what really felt compelling as you began to work on this project?
Yeah, so as you say, I'm down in Charleston, and as you say, I lead the investigations team. We do a lot of these multi-month projects. We looked into the prison system, sea level rise. Right now, we're looking into corruption and misconduct across South Carolina. But at the heart of things, I mean, I started out and spent a lot of years as a crime reporter. I was like a frontline cops and courts reporter. I'd go out every day and cover all sorts of mayhem around Charleston County and this area. And I'm sitting there, I think it was like last November, Connor had written a story about this motion for a retrial. I'd never heard of this case before. And I'm reading, I'm like, 1975. Wow, that's pretty old. And as I get into it, there's all these little tidbits about there's a lost file. Well, they found this file that potentially exculpatory stuff, and then it disappears as they're looking at it. And there's this guy on this quest to look into this case. And then there's just all these different elements. It read like a really wild, B movie or crime novel, and it really caught my attention. I'd never heard of this case, and which seemed odd because I've been here 20 something years, and so I reached out to Ryan, and was like, who's this Connor Hughes guy? Because I had not met Connor or worked with him before. I'm like, this is a really cool story. You think he could do more with it? He said, sure. So we set up a call, and basically had been talking for months via Zoom, and just setting up this story and having weekly progress updates and planning it out. But it just seemed like there was so much more there. There were so many intriguing elements to it that I felt like we really needed to do the story justice with a deeper dive.
Yeah, speaking of so much more there, those of you who are watching this who've ever written anything know that sometimes the toughest part of the process is editing and condensing as opposed to simply writing. A lot was left on the cutting room floor on this particular story, and really for the purpose of, we were attempting to be able to tell this story in a way that people who were first coming to it could navigate and understand what was going on, and also as a helpful framework for those who have watched part or all of the podcast and needed some help sort of getting everything in order. And so there were a lot of details that we sort of cut down as we went through this in an attempt to accomplish that. Connor, one of the big parts that we did sort of trim and tighten a lot was related to the interrogation and the court process and proceedings that happened back in the 70s that resulted in Wakefield being sentenced. And can you talk a little bit about some of those details and some of the oddities or issues that came about back then?
Yeah, so one of the main sources that kind of let us know what law enforcement was thinking during this time was the 700-page case file that the investigators put together as they were essentially building their case against Charles Wakefield and trying to figure out what happened. And while there's really nothing in the case file at all to suggest why Charles Wakefield was ever a suspect to begin with, which was really strange to us, because that was always a question I had, is why did they ever think he did it? And I got the 700-page case file and there were still no answers, which was just kind of bizarre. But it did lay out kind of the interrogation methods that they were employing at the time. And, it was kind of a strange time for law enforcement where it was kind of an experimental phase where they were trying out a lot of new technology and a lot of new methods. And, their use of the polygraph, within a couple days of Wakefield becoming, of the shooting really, and Wakefield becoming a suspect, they gave him 2 polygraph tests. One was, or lie detector, I think everyone's kind of aware of what those are, but one was conducted by SLED and one was conducted by a private investigator in town who was a former cop, and he ran like a Taekwondo studio. And the SLED one found that there was no indication that he had any involvement, but the PI Taekwondo instructor said that he was involved. And there's so many questions about the reliability of lie detector tests. They're really kind of not considered reliable. They're not admissible in most court situations. And shortly after that, they also injected him with sodium pentothal or truth serum, which is also a very questionable method. And they had all these inconclusive results that really didn't point to him at all, even though the methods that they were using weren't reliable to begin with. And it just really illustrated that the police really seemed to want to find something that they could hang a case on against Charles Wakefield, even though, again, there's really no indication at all as to why he was a suspect to begin with. And then in the trial, it was a death penalty trial at the time. Some of the charges against him, there was a mandated sentence of the death penalty. And so it was going to be a death penalty trial. And reading through archival newspaper articles, the case file about kind of how all this played out, it was really it did not meet a modern standard for what you would expect in the lead up to a death penalty case. He had a public defender who had a heart attack less than a month before the trial. He was assigned a private attorney who had 20 or so days to build a defense in a death penalty case. And he filed a motion asking for it to be delayed, and it was denied. And something that didn't make it into the story that was that private attorney was dealing with an incredible amount of private family things at the time. He had a child who was gravely ill in another state that he was trying to care for while he was building this death penalty defense in a very short amount of time. And something that really stood out to me was, there were really 2 key witnesses in this case that the prosecution hung their case on. And one was May McIntyre. She was a woman who came forward 8 months after the fact and said that she was at the crime scene, despite none of the other eyewitnesses saying that they saw her there. And a 18-year-old named Wyatt Earp Harper, who was serving 10 years for armed robbery at the time. And something that we touch on in the story is that May McIntyre's son-in-law had been, in the months after the shooting, had been arrested and sentenced to 24 years in state prison for a series of house break-ins. And one of the questions that they asked May McIntyre, that the defense attorneys asked May McIntyre while she was on the stand, was, did that have anything to do with her decision to come forward to try and shave time off of her son's prison sentence? And she said no, and the trial just kind of went on. But it became very clear that, within a month or two of this trial ending, his sentence was commuted from 24 years to 5 months. And when I spoke with Billy Wilkins, who's the chief prosecutor on this case and is, really just an institution in South Carolina legal communities. He said he wasn't aware of any deal at the time while this trial was going on, but he could only imagine that was linked to the fact that Mae McIntyre had done this. And he did remember something to do with that having influenced her decision to come forward to try and curry preferential treatment. And then, Wyatt Harper, who's this 18-year-old who came forward, he later recanted and basically said, nothing I said was true. I was pressured to do this. He was half of the entire evidence against Charles Wakefield that almost cost him his life. And he later recanted his entire story and said, I was doing it just out of self-preservation. I was trying to get a better deal from police and prosecutors. So, I mean, these are the two people that the prosecution hung their case on. There was absolutely no physical evidence of this happening. The crime didn't necessarily fit, their theory didn't fit what the crime scene was. I mean, it was clearly an execution style killing. And these two very unreliable witnesses who were clearly in it for personal gain, or at least partially, are the ones who almost sent Charles Wakefield to the electric chair. So it was just a hugely problematic case that didn't meet, what you would think is the modern standard of what a death penalty case would be.
Glenn, in your experience with crime in courts in the past, what stood out to you in this story, in particular that piece?
Yeah, I mean, all the stuff that Connor just described. I mean, it's you can tell just from listening to Connor here, he's become sort of a walking encyclopedia on this case, and it's fascinating too, because he's learned so much about sort of the underbelly of the upstate at that time, and these various gangs and bank robbers and folks who were roaming the countryside, and all these different heists and other things that sort of dovetailed into this event. Yeah, look at the truth serum and the use of the polygraphs. And if you look at the sketch the police had, the composite sketch, how it looked nothing like Charles Wakefield. And then again, all these things that sort of popped up in this brief, in addition to this case file, or this letter that had been discovered in some files that suggested that one of the previous sheriffs had helped frame him with the help of some deputies. There was other things like potentially the murder weapon showing up many years later, found in some guy's attic. I mean, there's just so many little inconsistencies and weird side roads in this thing that lead you to all sorts of doubt, I guess. It deserved a deep dive.
Right. Connor, with a story like this, there are always things we still don't know. What are the biggest unknowns still in this? What stands out to you as questions that still remain unanswered and frankly may never get an answer?
Sure. So I mean, I think one of the big ones is what Glenn has mentioned, is this file that was discovered, this letter that appeared to be from one of the former Sheriff Cash Williams' mistresses to a police chief, saying that Cash Williams had been in some way involved in framing Charles Wakefield and possibly the murders. What the significance of that and what exactly it says and how it disappeared. I mean, just the fact that it did vanish just without a trace. A SLED investigation was conducted to try and find it. No one was charged. The file was never found. Just raises a whole lot of questions. And what happened to it? I mean, whether it will ever be found again, or whether it still exists, or it's been destroyed, it's really unclear whether it was just actually somebody just lost it, or if there was something more to it. That's a huge question that's still out there.
And not to interrupt you, but
sure.
One of the things I think was in an original draft of the story, and frankly, it was so confusing, may not be the right word, but it certainly felt like an aside while we tried to tighten this down. The chain of custody on that file was sort of mind-blowing, wasn't it? It seemed like nobody really took any responsibility for it at all.
Yeah, I mean, I went through several hours of SLED interviews with the police officers who had it, and it changed from hand to hand, from officer to officer. And every time everyone was just like, well, we didn't really look at it. We didn't think it was very important, and just kind of seemed to dismiss it, say, I never looked at it close enough to see what was in there. There was a point where it went to the cold case unit as essentially the last time it's confirmed anyone had hands on it. Both of the officers there were actually officers with the police department when the loopers were killed. So they were very much a part of the law enforcement community from the the mid 70s, although they said that they had no connection to the case at the time. But one of them said they gave it to a sergeant over violent crimes, and she had retired, so it must have just gone missing off her desk. They went to the sergeant, asked the SLED agents went to the sergeant, asked her. She said, well, no, that he must be confused. I never got it. That doesn't sound familiar to me at all. And that's where it ended. It seemed to have vanished somewhere in between those two places. So it was kind of a strange thing, seeing that kind of everyone who got it seemed to dismiss it out of hand or never really took it seriously. Aside from the chief at the time, who has since resigned, whose name was Ken Miller. He seemed to take it seriously, and he's the one who got the actual Innocence project in North Carolina involved. I know that there's been some questions I saw in the Q&A. Somebody asking about the fact that South Carolina doesn't have an Innocence project. There's really no nonprofit or any kind of institution here to do that. So Ken Miller had to go outside of the state, find an institution in North Carolina to come and pick this case up, and they're still involved in it, and their CEO is an executive director, is representing Charles Wakefield. But yeah, there was really nobody other than Ken Miller within the police department who seemed to be taking it seriously at all.
Right. Since you brought up Innocent Project, Glenn, let me throw that to you. There are a number of states that have some level of organization or project devoted to looking into cases in which someone may have been wrongly sentenced or accused. Tell us a little bit about what goes on in South Carolina and whether there's ever been any momentum on that front.
Yeah, so back in, I believe it was the early 2000s, there was an Innocence Project that was started by a Columbia criminal defense attorney, and he was outspoken on some various issues about getting funding for DNA testing and things like that. And I believe they took up some cases. There's never been, I don't believe, a sanctioned Innocence Project that was related to the national organization that everyone knows about. There is, I have noticed, there's a website up now under the same name. The previous one was the Palmetto Innocence Project. It looks like it's a fairly new website that went live this year. It says board of directors coming soon. There's no contact information. Basically, the mission seems in line with the national, and it seems like there is some sort of an effort to get something rolling again on this. They definitely have made an appeal for funding. I checked on some of the websites. If you're a nonprofit, you have to file like a 990 form, basically stating your finances and who's involved, and they have not filed anything yet. So really don't know who is behind that and how far along they are, or whether they've made overtures to the national organization or not. So you may see something on the horizon. I guess we'll have to wait and see what they have to say.
Okay. Connor, we had a question come in, and I think it alludes to something that you'd probably flesh out a little bit more. The viewer asks, if they're remembering correctly, that part of the reason Charles Wakefield was picked up at all is there was an existing warrant that day. It was just kind of a way they could pick him up. In addressing that, can you also talk about any other potential suspects in this, and in some ways why Wakefield became a bit of a convenient person to accuse for this?
Sure. So speaking to the warrant, I mean, it was a third-degree assault and battery warrant, which talking to Charles about and looking through the case files, essentially he got into a scuffle in downtown Greenville. Some guy picked a fight with his cousin. They got into a fight, and they had this warrant on him that they had just kind of been sitting on until these officers were killed, and they started kind of rounding people up. But it's very clear that for whatever reason, they really, had their eye on Charles Wakefield. I talked to Billy Wilkins about that, and he said basically he couldn't tell me much about it, but it was a confidential informant had told them something. That doesn't appear in the case file anywhere. There's a bunch of confidential informants and tips and call-ins and all sorts of things that are there, just dozens and dozens of them, but this particular one isn't. So there's really no indication as to why. But I think it is definitely worth pointing out, and something that Brad really does a phenomenal job of exploring the murder, et cetera, that there was just a tremendous amount of corruption going on in law enforcement during this era in Greenville County. And there was a lot of just organized crime. I mean, the Dixie Mafia is what some people call, it's kind of this loose association, maybe not as hierarchical as some people might think of, organized crime, in those terms. But it was certainly, I mean, an association of criminals, robbers, murderers, guns for hire. And within that, there were these more organized gangs like the Dawson Gang, which was a very organized, well-orchestrated bank robbery outfit. And in this case file, there's a lot of time and attention spent on a guy named Larry Poole, who seemed to have pretty strong ties to the Dixie Mafia, who certainly, at least on some level, seemed to have ties to the Dawson Gang. He was seen by multiple people driving around with a guy named Frank Walker, who was a former Greenville County deputy who became essentially a gun for hire, was later convicted of murder. Ahead of this, and Frank Walker had, as Brad explores in the podcast, had ties to the Dawson Gang. And there was corruption within law enforcement. A guy named Bub Skelton is kind of one of the key examples. Frank Walker is another. He became a gun driver, but Bub Skelton was one of the higher ups at the sheriff's office, and he was essentially in the Dawson Gang, on the Dawson Gang's payroll. And that, and talking to Billy Wilkins, he said, he qualified it by saying, most deputies were on the straight and narrow, but that having that level of corruption that high up in the sheriff's office certainly bled down into other deputies. So having all of this kind of swirling around it, and while that's happening, I mean, someone we haven't really talked about very much, just because of time constraints during this session, is Frank Looper, who is this firebrand, kind of straight and narrow, true believer guy who is really doing his best to run this narcotics unit at the time. And he's, while all of this is going on, he's telling his family that he's working on one of the biggest cases of his life. His house is shot up, his grandfather's house is shot up, and then he ends up killed. I mean, it was in the theory that Wakefield they said it was a burglary gone wrong, but it was, he had one gunshot behind the left ear, and his father had one gunshot behind the left ear. It seemed very much like a gangland execution. So it just seems, the theory of the case just does not seem to fit with the details of the crime. And going back to Larry Poole, this person who they spent a lot of time looking at, he had been convicted of murder, sentenced to life, escaped from prison, was out on the run when all this happened. And we tried to find him, and there's just absolutely no record of him, despite his record, despite a life sentence in prison. And Brad has tried to find him as well. We couldn't find a death certificate. We couldn't find an address. We couldn't find a phone number. We just couldn't find him, which is just bizarre given his history. So there's just still, back to the questions that are related to this case, there's just still so much that has yet to be uncovered.
Connor, briefly, what happens next? You mentioned that, that Wakefield wants a chance to prove his innocence. What's the next step here?
Sure. So as I mentioned, he has filed for a retrial based essentially on evidence that was uncovered during the course of Brad's reporting for the Murder, Etc. podcast. The discovery and disappearance of this file, which Brad discovered in this .32 Rossi revolver, which was found by Mae McIntyre's, the witness in this case, by her son, matches the description and was tested with inconclusive results, against the bullets that killed Frank and Rufus Looper. So that they've requested a retrial really hinging on those two pieces of evidence. And it's just, the last I'd heard, I believe it was sent to an administrative judge. The prosecutor here, actually, Bill Wilkinson, Walt Wilkins, the 13th Circuit solicitor, he's recused himself, and it's now with the Attorney General's office. So they're handling the case for the state, and it's been essentially stalled out because of the pandemic. So it's really just kind of a waiting game at this point.
All right. Well, that's all the time we have. Connor will obviously keep an eye on this. So stay tuned if there are any updates with this. Glenn and Connor, thank you both for being with us today. Thank you for all of you for watching and for your questions. We will post a recording of this on our website, probably within about 24 hours in case you want to watch it again. You can find that at postandcourier.com/beyond-the-headlines, or you can simply Google Beyond the Headlines Post and Courier. You'll find it that way. You can also support our work by signing up for any of our free newsletters. You can find that at postandcourier.com/Greenville newsletter-sign up, or just email me. I'll be happy to help you out. Paid subscribers make our brand of journalism possible and are absolutely essential to what we do and keep our communities informed. If you can find a way to support us, a subscription would be a fantastic way to do that. You can find that at postandcourier.com/Greenville/subscribe. And since we've got Glenn on here and we have been highlighting this quite a bit lately, you can also support our investigative efforts. Visit postandcourier.com, look near the top of the page. You'll find a link to be able to donate specifically to our investigative fund, which helps us work on exposing corruption and public misuse of funds across the state. We appreciate any help you can give us there. Thanks for your time, and we'll see you again next time. Have a great day.
The Post and Courier really has come to represent the gold standard in local journalism, and I couldn't be more excited to be a part of that. With a family-owned operation, the focus is about investing in journalism, investing in the communities where that journalism is being done, which I think is a little bit different than what we've seen with national companies and larger chains. There's a much stronger connection between the journalists and the people who are running the paper, which really comes through in the product. Having a strong local media outlet means you have a voice in the room and people asking questions to power to make sure that things are done correctly. And that's what your subscription pays for.